I am Leslie Engelking. I am the founder of Foundation of Cannabis Unified Standards, FOCUS for short. The AFDO-FOCUS relationship it's very synergistic because we're similar organizations with similar missions, just working in different areas. So where AFDO works with FDA and Food and Drug, FOCUS is a health and safety organization for cannabis. And because we're both sort of this third-party, extension of that, it's just been a real natural working relationship. And one of the big challenges in the cannabis industry is a real lack of trust and communication between regulatory and industry. And as a result of not having that communication, a lot of problems that would have easily been solved are not, because nobody's talking about them. The industry has a lot of insight into how to make things better that regulators need. And likewise, regulators have a lot of knowledge that would help industry operate better and navigate regulations more easily and those kind of things. And so our job in everything we do as partners in all of this is really to just try and bring that insight from both sides of the industry to really help add better protections for health and safety and quality, and help this industry progress into a very safe and legal and sustainable industry. Cannabis is developed across the U.S. at the state level. Obviously, we still do not have any federal oversight. And even when you look at hemp being legalized through the 2018 Farm Bill, it only legalized hemp and provided guidance to industry up until the point of harvest. So once that agricultural product is cut down in the field and harvested, there is no guidance for operators, for anybody that wants to manufacture it, sell it, that kind of stuff. And so one of the projects that we worked on together over the last 2 years was developing a model code for orally consumed hemp products. And this is hugely important because you only need to look at your local grocery store or convenience store or gas station, and you'll see hemp products everywhere. Yet there's nothing out there to guide these operators on how do I make the same product twice? How do I make sure it's consistent? How do I make sure it doesn't present risk to health and safety? How do I make sure that I'm giving proper warnings and labeling? And so that is what we created, and we did it based on the 2017 Food Code, which is what most hemp is going into these days. And there's really no guidance for, I'm putting an oil or an extract of hemp into a food product. How does that change the food product? We don't know that. And so it's really important that we're still including all the protections from a food safety standpoint in cannabis as well. And we saw what happened with the vape crisis, right? Just a couple years ago. It seems like ages now, but that happened because people were putting carrier oils mixed in with the cannabis oil that had not been approved as safe for inhalation. It wasn't that anybody was out there trying to, poison people or get them sick, yet tons of people died from it and got very sick, right? So the guidance is so necessary because industry is going to innovate. And in the cannabis industry, innovation is just staggering at the rate that it takes place. They don't innovate around health and safety. They innovate around product development. And that sort of comes as a secondary. And in any other industry that's regulated, it's the agencies that license those operations that give that industry guidance. But because we don't have the federal oversight, the states have just developed these programs without any good manufacturing practices, standards, or just general guidance for how to meet the regulations in a meaningful way. I mean, there's a couple challenges here. So you have to understand that when cannabis started becoming legal at the state level, it happened through voter initiatives, which means regulatory agencies in those states where the voter initiatives took place were forced to regulate something they know nothing about. There was no training for them. There was nothing. And what they were regulating is a product that had been, or a plant that had been illegal for decades, that there is just so much stigma and marketing and information about the ills of it that really have never been proven. And so as science goes forward, we're learning more and more, and I think that the regulators that in my experience, have had a hard time sort of moving past that stigma. And then I think because the regulations change so much, I think there's a lack of understanding from the regulatory side on the real impact that has on a business. There's no industry that changes regulations as fast as this industry. I mean, there are companies making billions off just tracking regs because they literally are that difficult to keep up with. And one of our interviewees talked about, the impact to their business. So I do think that there's sort of not an understanding on the impact of the ever-changing regulations, but I think also it's somehow related to the stigma that's still with cannabis, if that makes sense. The first step in all of that, in sort of understanding the industry and working better and regulating better, is really understanding the plant and the life cycle of the plant from a scientific standpoint, from a manufacturing standpoint. So understanding where, what that looks like as the plant moves from a harvested material into an extract, into a product. A lot of states don't regulate from a scientific perspective. They don't have anybody with a science background involved in this, and certainly not at the legislative level. And so we see a lot of wonky regulations that don't necessarily make sense from a quality or safety standpoint when you understand the industry, but they're put in place oftentimes because of fear. And stigma, this is it's a new scary thing to regulate. And I think that's kind of where it starts. I also just think that, and again, it goes back to stigma always, but the communication between the cannabis industry and the regulatory community is really, really poor. So much different than it is in food or pharma. Right? I mean, these are industries that work with their regulatory partners and really, their testing labs and this and that. And I think because of the history of cannabis and sort of this idea of what a cannabis operator is like and their intent, and certainly because there's been quite a few bad operators in the cannabis industry that have given them reason to think that communication isn't there. And I think that everything would move faster. Public health would be protected at a much greater and much quicker level if that communication was happening. If you're looking at somebody that is in their 60s and 70s and 80s, these folks have only known prohibition. They, maybe they were around before, but it wouldn't have been at an age where it would have impacted them. And so that, whether it is recognized or it's something internal that is not, people aren't even cognizant of, it impacts the way they think about this. And it's not bad you for thinking that way. It's a very natural thing. And I think that's where communication really needs to come in and get involved. And I honestly don't think that the cannabis industry has done its job on effectively communicating with regulatory, right? They sort of tend to stomp their feet and, pound their fists and demand change, but they don't explain it. And there's not a lot of educational exchanges to try and come to a place of understanding and then work from there. And I think it's really, I worked in mental health before, and we worked very hard for many, many years to try and change the stigma with mental health and to argue for parity in mental health care and physical health care. I see that same thing happening here. I mean, back in the day, depression was a bad word, right? Just like cannabis was a bad word. And it takes time. Big ships turn slowly. But I think, patience and understanding voice and education and communication are the key to really changing all that. Oh, for sure. I mean, anybody can open a newspaper today or turn on the TV or walk into a gas station and see some kind of cannabis product, whether, it's hemp or it's marijuana in a dispensary, whether it's the news talking about, the latest product, the latest bill that's going on at the federal level or the state level. This is here to stay. It's not. And I think that's where the communication and the education becomes really important, because the longer we sort of dig our heels in the sand and say, we're not, this is bad, means the longer we're not learning and not making progress, right? And so, but again, I think that's about having a calm voice and really having educational discussions with regulators that allow them to understand more, but also to see the industry as human and not a bunch of criminals. And truthfully, that's, where it came from. So it's not that today, but that stigma is still there. And so I think that really just getting to know people. In the states that I see and the programs that I see that are successful, that's what's happened. There's a working relationship between industry and regulatory, and both value that relationship and are willing to participate and contribute to it because they see how it makes it better. Absolutely. So you'll see people that today will absolutely use a CBD product or a hemp product or even a THC product for sleep that 10 years ago would not have touched it. Absolutely not. That's where we want to get. Not everybody using these products, but everybody having an understanding level that they're willing to open their mind and see that there's some benefit to this. This is not all scary. Patient education, consumer education is critical. I'll take a step back and say what I see as one of the biggest problems in the cannabis industry on the industry side. This has nothing to do with regulations or anybody on that side, but this industry is almost unable to collaborate. And because of that, I mean, and you get it, right? It's a green rush. Everybody wants to stick their stake in the ground, but the reality is there is plenty of business for everyone. And by not collaborating, we don't have a unified voice. And so that the message that goes out to consumers is all over the board. I mean, you can read one, just do a Google search on one topic in cannabis, and you can see 20 different articles that have all different points that do not coincide or work together at all. That's a problem. And so there's a lot of consumer education happening. It's just not great consumer education, and it's not reliable, and it's not standardized. The other problem I see related to that is, and especially when you're talking about the consumers will complain, right? Or patients will complain if a product doesn't work or it's not safe or whatever. That is not a clear process on how to do that in cannabis yet. Most states, and I've had this run around as Focus, as a health and safety organization, saying, okay, there's an unsafe product here, and I report it to the Department of Health in that state that's regulating that product, and they say, we can't do anything about it. We can call the local FDA office, the regional FDA office that oversees in that state, and they'll say, I'm not sure if we can get involved in this. So that conflict between the state and federal law causes a lot of problems, aside from just not being able to transport state to state. But much of this confusion is really from that. And it makes it harder for everybody, right? I mean, it's not that it just makes it harder for industry. It certainly makes it harder for the regulatory community. I mean, even, as I mentioned, writing the model code document, I mean, you got to try to take into account, okay, we've got federal laws we're trying to follow, but there's going to be state level implementations that are challenging. And so there's just, it really is that chaos comes from the disconnect. That's where some of this adult use legalization at the state level has been really helpful, because it's giving these universities permissions in the states that they're domiciled to actually do that. But I mean, the reality is cannabis has been used as medicine for decades and decades, if not hundreds of years longer, right? It's just, we have old drugs from Pfizer and Lilly and, all these companies that were based on cannabis. It's not news that it's medicine or that it's therapeutic in nature. That shouldn't have gone away, right? And had we been tracking that since those days and doing research since those days, we would be in a completely different place. But I mean, the lack of research at any level is difficult, right? I mean, even if you want to do the research, it's a Schedule I drug. Where do you get it? You have to get it in your state. You have to get it from a licensed facility. You have to trust the licensed facility. You have to, I mean, there's just, it's such a convoluted process. There's so many hoops to jump through that it's not hard to understand why universities don't. I mean, thankfully, like I said, some of this adult use regs are really helping push states. But yeah, I mean, I think that's got to have a huge impact. We depend on universities in this country to lead our research and guide where we need to go. And that's where the scientists are, right? I mean, that's what we need. The foundation of any good relationship, anything, is always communication, right? We don't have that between industry and regulatory. We don't have it from state to state. We're starting to see it, but really it hasn't been there. And we certainly don't see it from within a state between agencies, like the interagency cooperation and communication is lacking around cannabis for sure. And I think that is the most important factor. Now, in order to make that communication possible, it means that from a regulatory perspective, you've got to take off this hat of this is scary, this is bad, this is illegal, and you need to start thinking about cannabis like corn. I mean, it's just that simple. I don't know any regulator that gets upset when the idea of like talking about harvesting corn or about manufacturing corn into an oil product or into a food product. It's the same thing we're doing in cannabis, but it's scary. So why is it scary? It's scary because of that stigma, right? It's not scary because of the product, because we're very accustomed to taking harvested material, making it into other forms, and selling it. So I think that, and until that fear is removed, the communication is very difficult to have. And then I think that the third thing, and that's really important, is some real scientific-based training on the plant, the life cycle, the challenges in production, in manufacturing, in retail, and really just, again, we need to talk about it, and then we can train on it. We work together to bring some training for food safety regulators so that they can better understand the cannabis industry. And we've taken some existing courses that were designed for food safety regulators and made them into cannabis safety courses using focused standards and information from our experts and stuff, so that we have a baseline of training that we can provide regulators so that they can be more effective at their jobs and understand things better. And it's our goal to continue to develop and improve those, as well as there's some cannabis-specific training from Focus that is based on our standards that really go through the whole cannabis supply chain from top to bottom on what's important, what to think about, and that. And so it's really our hope that by starting there and having a baseline to build from, we can create some real change quickly.